This podcast is brought to you by Pragmatic Solutions, the leading iGaming PAM platform with a modular approach, including many benefits like a fast, secure, and scalable API-based platform, integrated with all major third-party products and services. Make sure you head over to Pragmatic Solutions and join our smart thinking.
And well, how the tables have turned here today, Jesse. How are you doing?
I'm great, Pierre. Yeah, I'm on the other side of the table today. As I was just saying to you, I've been asking the questions for about 65 episodes now. And this is only like the second time I've been on the other side of the table being asked questions. So go easy on me today, but really happy to be here with you.
All right, I can't make any promises, but nonetheless, very happy to have you here as well. And obviously, I had the pleasure of being a guest at your podcast here, the Betting Startup podcast a while ago, which was also a bit of a nerve-wracking experience, but nonetheless, very fun. And also, it's been just great to get to know you, Jesse, over the last couple of months here, as we are starting to work together between iGaming Next and Betting Startup podcast. But, without me going too much into detail here, it'd be great to have an introduction of yourself, Jesse. Obviously, you're the podcast host and the founder of Betting Startup Podcast. You've interviewed a ton of startup founders, especially on the North American side. But you yourself have a quite interesting and long background in the industry that hasn't perhaps been talked too much about. So I'd love for you to just kind of do the rundown. You were born, now you are here. What happened in between, Jesse?
All right. Well, I'll try and keep this brief so to not put you and the audience to sleep here. The origin story, Pierre, I guess, as it relates to the podcast, probably starts in around 2010. So I'll start it there. That really was the entrance into the industry for me. Obviously, it was a much different world 13 years ago with respect to the betting and iGaming industry. Obviously, from a North American perspective, there was nothing going on. But in 2010, like through my own betting journey as a customer, I guess in the early 2000s, like I really perceived there to be a lack of tools to do like basic, analysis on bets and things like that. And the ecosystem at that time was very immature as far as tools are concerned. So, 2010, the iPhone had been out for a couple of years. Sort of the idea of tech startups was becoming a bit more of like a common thing. And, I was at a point in my life around that time where I thought, you know what, there's nobody else out there seemingly building these betting tools. Why not me? So I put together a team. We raised a little bit of money. I had a plan, a vision, and we set out to work. And we kind of did the cliche tech startup thing where we, got an office, we built an MVP, and we were really trying to find product market fit. And I guess just to talk briefly about like what it is we were trying to build. Again, like talking about it today here in 2023 with everything going on in the landscape seems almost silly to discuss. But like, again, back then there was just a huge gap. And what we were doing was building very basic bet tracking software for starters. On top of that, we did some pretty cool stuff around sort of like arbitrage detection and some stuff like that. But really like our secret sauce at that time was this software that we just called trends software, right? So the whole idea of a trend in betting is, you look at an upcoming fixture and sort of look at the conditions of the fixture and the circumstances of the teams in it. And basically a trend, you can look retrospectively. I think we had like 10 years worth of historical data for the US sports league. So we basically, cleaned up this very messy pile of data, put a layer of sort of like a query engine on top of it, and basically allowed people to ask questions about how an upcoming fixture has done retrospectively. Again, this is like 13 years ago. There's a lot of stuff out there now that does this, but then there was nothing. And the cool thing we did, Pierre, was that when people found a trend that they thought was compelling and that the data showed was historically profitable, what we did was we allowed users to actually save a trend, meaning every single day our software would look at the day's fixtures, look at the different scenarios for each fixture. And if somebody had a trend saved that was in play for the match, essentially we sent out a push alert, which was basically a marketing trigger for that user to go place a bet, right? They get a nice push alert to their phone. It says, this fixture is live tonight. It's historically profitable. One tap CTA, go, click through to your sportsbook of choice and place the bet. It was really cool stuff, but what I now understand is there was really no market for it at that time. And again, we started with US sports, so there was nothing going on here. What ended up happening through a bit of serendipity was our product got discovered by somebody from a company called Opta Sports, which is now part of the Perform Group, which I think is actually Stats Perform now. I've lost sort of the progression of that company. But anyways, at one time It was Opta, and Opta had all of the data rights for soccer, for football. So they reached out to us and said, hey guys, we really like what you've done here with this product. It fits nicely with the way we're trying to make football data available to punters in the UK and the markets in which Opta distributes its data. And we did an adapted version of our software for soccer. And that kind of really, I think, sort of propelled us into looking at the UK and Europe and working with companies out there, understanding that market was far more mature than the non-existent North American market at that time. So sort of set us on a bit of a trajectory. Unfortunately, and I do admit, like, we also fell victim to being unable to find product market fit with the runway we had with the angel round we had raised. So we also found ourselves in this precarious position where we were essentially out of money, which is not a great place to be. And making matters worse, we didn't have any investors really lining up to write us another check to continue to extend the runway. So again, through a bit of serendipity, which is sort of a separate story altogether, but we ended up out one night in San Francisco with a couple of guys that were from this company called William Hill, and they were sent over. They were sent over to San Francisco. This is 2012, remember, right? It was like 10 years ago. So they were sent over to San Francisco on a bit of a mission to quote unquote like find smart people in Silicon Valley and find the next innovation for William Hill. So they were basically sent on a mission from Gibraltar. We were down in San Francisco trying to get meetings with investors. We ended up out drinking with these guys one night. Long story short, Pierre, sitting around, having drinks with them, getting along famously. They said to us, hey guys, you're great guys. We like what you're doing. Clearly, you know what you're doing in terms of this technical capability and building these things and having a vision and being able to sort of execute against that vision. Unfortunately, what you have isn't really what we're looking for, but we happen to have this massive backlog of projects and we need some people to help us bring those to market. Can we hire you guys to do that? And we said, well, we're not really in that business, but also we're out of money and you're offering us money. So yeah, guess what? We're in. And like a week later, we were, my co-founders and I were on a plane over to Gibraltar and we spent a week in the William Hill offices on the Rock. And basically that sort of was the start of an accidental sort of, I don't want to say pivot, but extension of our business into professional services. And basically for the next 4 years, we ended up building a lot of bespoke product for some of the main operators in the UK and Europe, as well as a lot of the other big brands in the space that are sort of serving operators. And, I guess through that, we really, really got a lot of experience and subject matter expertise and domain expertise building betting related products. And we did that for about 4 or 5 years, while at the same time sort of using the revenue from the services business to continue to fund organically our product ambitions. And we continuously tried to iterate on our product and find PMF, but we had some success, but we never quite broke through. And eventually, after 4 or 5 years, we got a little bit fatigued, sort of being mercenaries, guns for hire, if you will, delivering other people's projects. And just wasn't that fulfilling to be bringing products to market that weren't our own. So long story short on that chapter, Pierre, with my first startup, after about 5 years of really grinding hard, paying our dues, getting the experience, building our own reputations, all of that, we were getting a bit fatigued. And through, again, a bit of serendipity, we found ourselves on a plane to Curacao in the Caribbean in 2015. And we met with our friends at Pinnacle Sports down in the Caribbean in 2015. And we actually went down there to pitch them on a strategic partnership that we were excited about. And, as happens, I guess, over the course of that week in Curacao and after several conversations and meetings with Pinnacle, the conversation shifted from, hey guys, this partnership probably isn't for us, but hey, while you're here, what do you think about the idea of possibly winding down your own operations and your team basically comes and joins Pinnacle as a product innovation team, which a couple months later we signed the deal and our company was acquired by Pinnacle. I then packed my bags along with my co-founder and we moved from, it was actually January 2nd, so literally the middle of winter in Canada, packed our bags and relocated down to the island of Curacao in the Caribbean and spent 6 years with Pinnacle Sports. So it was really interesting, to go from sort of the supplier side of the ecosystem and then suddenly overnight becoming an operator, right? And spending 6 years as an operator, myself personally, I was director of product management. So really pushing forward, some modernization within Pinnacle's product delivery. And, Pinnacle at that time was really, I think, going through a maturation process whereby, they really needed to accelerate some initiatives. And I think our team and kind of what our body of work over the 4 or 5 years that we were doing it really resonated with them to the point where, they really wanted us to come in and we worked together to push some initiatives forward. So that was sort of the start of another crazy chapter and crazy 6 year journey. But fast forward, Pierre, the last year and a half, I've kind of come back out onto my own after 6 years with Pinnacle. I decided the time was right for me to kind of go back out on my own. I was, admittedly feeling the entrepreneurial fire burning in my belly again a little bit. And for the last year and a half, I've been kind of dabbling in different things, least of which is the podcast, which you mentioned. So that's a fairly long arc to the origin story. But yeah, those are sort of the main chapters of my time in this industry. And yeah, it's suddenly been like 13, 14 years now. So here we are.
I love that, Jesse. And obviously you've had like the true, let's say, entrepreneurial experience here by going through this like really gritty experience of building your startup and obviously facing difficulties, difficulty fundraising, and then ending it with an exit. And obviously, as you have now founded your podcast, the Betting Content podcast. And by the way, for those who haven't checked out this podcast, it's absolutely brilliant. I would urge anyone to subscribe to it. It's fantastic, and it certainly keeps me up to date of what's happening in the startup landscape in the North American market. So obviously you've interviewed a wide range of startup founders through the podcast. It's something like 60, 70 episodes, something along those lines at the moment. What have you learned through your journey interviewing startup founders?
So I think my answer to this is maybe a little bit less about like what I've learned from my guests, but maybe more so around like what I've learned for myself through this so far.
Right.
Again, like, when I started the podcast, I'd just come off of this sort of like 6-year chapter with Pinnacle. I was on the executive leadership team. I had a remit with like, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 functional teams under me, 80 something people. Like it was a very like manager heavy type role. And again, for me, sort of skewing more towards sort of like the entrepreneur side of the spectrum. I was just finding myself sort of like craving the need to build something and create something, right? So I guess for me, like the podcast was, something that I've always wanted to do, but it's always been a very scary thing, right? Like none of us like hearing the sound of our own voice, including me. I had literally zero experience with podcasting, right? Like I'd never even been a guest on a podcast, let alone, started one or thought I was qualified to start one. But after I left Pinnacle, like I really felt the need to create. I wanted to do something. I wanted to challenge myself. So I guess to your question around like, what have I learned? The idea of starting a podcast was brutally scary, right? But through that discomfort and that scariness, like is obviously is where growth comes from. And putting yourself in a position of discomfort and leaning into that discomfort is really one of the things I've learned. Like if something is in front of me as a possibility and it excites me, but it also scares me, that scariness is actually the cue to lean into it and go for it rather than shy away from it, right? So it's a bit counterintuitive, but really one of the big learnings for me is just like, more so just a reminder that like that is a fundamental truth with anything that I'm looking at or anything I potentially involve myself in, is if it's scary and if there's growth opportunity, that's something I actually should be running towards rather than away from. So, that's probably the main thing. I guess the other thing I would say, Pierre, is like, it's one thing to sit there and ask the questions, but one thing I maybe didn't appreciate at the start that I definitely appreciate now is that there's an art to asking questions, and it's really given me like a whole new respect for professional broadcasters, media personalities, other podcasters, people that are basically asking questions for a living. It's not as easy or as obvious as it sounds, and the ability to drive a conversation through asking questions definitely is something that I think I probably took for granted a little bit when I started it. And, I've been a bit of a student of the game here, learning as I go and getting better at it. I got a lot of work to do still, but you know how it is, right? I think that's the biggest learning for me so far is like, I really undersold myself on how difficult it actually was and how much work is actually required to do it well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great answer, I think. And, if there is such a thing as a purpose in life, I think it is to find yourself with one foot in the known and one foot in the unknown, right? So if something is too easy, it gets boring. If something is too hard, you stop, right? You are not able to continue. But when you have one foot in the known and one foot in the unknown, that's where the magic happens. That's where you kind of find purpose. And so to your point here of kind of like diving headfirst into something new and difficult, I think this is very much the purpose that we have in life, is to find yourself in those situations. And when you then start the podcast and you realize that this is something that you can master, you are doing like incredibly well as a podcast host. Then the motivation that comes from that to continue to do difficult things, of course, it's great as well. Is that something you've been thinking about as well when you have gone through the journey? Like how was, like if I ask you this, like how was the first episode compared to the last episode that you did?
So look, I'll admit, like so when I started it, of course, when you don't have anything at the beginning, you have nothing by definition, right? So I'm like, hey, I want to start a podcast. Getting the first guest is going to be difficult though, because I don't have a podcast. So how am I going to convince somebody to come on this non-existent podcast, right? So
Right.
what I did for the first 3 episodes, I reached out to, industry friends that have companies and said, hey, here's what I'm doing as a personal favor. Would you do this for me? They all said yes. So shout out to John from Incentive Games, Adam from Thrive Fantasy, and Omer from Sports IQ for being my first 3 guests. I lined all 3 of those up and then released them at the same time. And I have to admit that I haven't listened to those 3 episodes since because it's so cringe. I can't bear the thought of listening to them again.
I can relate to that as well.
Yeah, right. Like all that to say, as with anything, the more reps you get in, the easier it gets, the more natural it becomes, the more comfortable it becomes, the less anxiety inducing it becomes. I still get nervous for every episode, don't get me wrong, but it comes a little bit easier now than maybe it did like 66 episodes ago or whatever. So it's a continual work in progress, but we're trending in the right direction with it all.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's such a good point, Jesse, that you mentioned, and I think something I'd like to talk today about a little bit more is kind of like how to start the podcast. What does it take? What personality do you need to be? But kind of as a prelude to that, I want to just mention my own kind of journey into the podcast as well. That I used to be terrified of speaking in front of people. It was like one of my worst phobias. Like it was kind of like, people are scared of snakes. For me, it was like speaking in front of people was my absolute biggest phobia. And, it was obviously limiting in my career because I wasn't able to go on stage. I wasn't able to even speak in front of big meetings. I have kind of like a speech impediment with a lot of filler noises, and I can kind of lose track of words and stuff like that from time to time. And so for me, the turning point was when we hosted the first iGaming Next Valletta in 2019. Okay, so the idea, we had a professional host who ended up not turning up. Okay, this was the biggest event we've ever organized. Okay, in 10 years. Yeah, go ahead.
It's like your worst nightmare, right? Basically,
yes,
happening right before your eyes. Yeah, okay.
Absolute worst nightmare, and it was the biggest event we ever did, right? And we had a room full of people. We managed to sell out this event. There was 800 people in the audience, or even more. It's like 1,000 people in the audience. And 2 hours before, no host, and then like 1 hour before, no host. And now we start to get nervous here. Like, where is the host? Like we go knock on his hotel room. No one opens. We get the hotel to open the room. No one is there. Okay, and now it's half an hour left. And with like 20 minutes to go, the team, we gather in a circle. The room is like totally packed outside. And we are like panicking. We don't know what to do. And we gather in a circle. And everyone looks at me as the MD. I look back. They look at me. And they, my production manager says like, Pierre, you got to do it, man. This is the only way. Yeah. And what are you going to do? I mean, we have to solve, we are problem solvers. That's who we are as event managers, right? So, okay, the production manager, he mics me up. Our ex-production manager, he's a world-class production manager, okay? He used to work for Live Nation, biggest concert organizers in the world, okay? He did conferences and concerts for like Prodigy, Red Hot Chili Peppers, the whole works, okay? He looks at me and he tells me, Pierre, everything's going to be okay. But when you see in someone that they don't mean it, that was my production manager, okay? He did not think it was going to be okay because he knew like my issues with speaking in front of people. Nonetheless, 3, 2, 1, up you go, and I was thrown into the stage. But the good thing about that was that I never had time to get nervous because we just needed the show to start, right? Like we just needed it to go on, and so we just needed to find a solution. So I went up there, kept it easy, went down, I survived, went back up there again. And throughout the day, I realized like, it's not that bad actually. Like, as I can actually do this, right? It's not going to be perfect. It's not like David Attenborough narrating Planet Earth or anything, but I can do it, And after that, it was a big turning point for me where anything that was put in front of me in terms of speaking in front of people or speaking publicly, I rationalized by telling myself that nothing can possibly be worse than having to go unprepared on stage in front of a conference and somehow try to mask it, and it still worked, right? And that's usually how it is when you speak in front of people. People tend to get so nervous and they put so much pressure on themselves, but actually the audience generally doesn't notice the kind of mistakes that you do and whatnot. I thought that was that was something that really helped me to get into this.
Well, I mean, talk about being thrown into the deep end of the pool, right? I mean, they say that, for most people, like the number one fear ahead of death is public speaking, right? So like to that end, like you're not alone in that. And, to be put in that situation and to have it go probably as well as it did, and probably without the vast majority of the audience, as you say, knowing that was even the plan, and now look, obviously like 4 years later, here we are, and now you're here, right? Like, so those types of moments, I think for people that, the unexpected ones is like really where like true growth comes from. And also like really also like developing your own confidence in yourself that like, when you're done, like I did it, right? I can do this. All the self-doubt, like those voices start to get a little bit quieter in your head once you actually do the scary thing. So no, man, that's a great anecdote, and yeah, relatable for sure.
Absolutely. And so my question to you, Jesse, is now that you've kind of built the podcast, you have a great audience already, you kind of gotten over the most difficult hump, which is to start the podcast and then to build an audience. If you now look back and you kind of analyze what does it take to start the podcast and what does it take to become successful as a podcast host, what would you say to people who perhaps consider to venture into starting their own podcast, but they don't know exactly what or how or so on and so forth? What are your kind of tips, your secrets into founding your own podcast?
I mean, this sounds very cliche and it's not a secret at all, but like for me, I had, again, like literally zero experience. So it just started with some basic research. I was Googling. The first thing I Googled was like, what microphone does Tim Ferriss use? And thinking that if it's good enough for Tim Ferriss, it's probably good enough for me. He used this $89 one from Amazon that he recommends. And I'm like, hey, if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me. So I ordered a microphone. And really like getting started, there's no actual impediment to getting started other than some, basic stuff, computer, microphone, whatever, right? Ignoring all of that, there's no actual impediment other than just starting, right? So I think like the biggest thing, and obviously it's easier said than done, right? Everything we just talked about with like overcoming the fear and the self-doubt and the imposter syndrome and, the sense that like, if you do this podcast, you're speaking into the void because nobody's listening anyway. So what the hell is the point? Nobody's even listening. Like all of that stuff, right? That's actually the hardest part. And it's not like a super useful answer to people. It's not that actionable, but like that is it, right? Do some research, figure it out, and just start. Like seriously, like the biggest thing, and this goes for any content, right? Not just audio over the podcast medium, whether it's writing, posting on social media or thought leadership on LinkedIn, like whatever it is. The biggest thing I found is just consistency, right? Staying consistent with the content creation is the biggest thing. And in doing so, having some confidence and some trust and some faith that good things will happen, right? And, it's I guess, you're instinctively, you want to like start to measure how am I doing and understand how you're doing. But the reality is like, at least for me in the first year of doing one podcast a week, there was like no metrics to speak of. I didn't really know if anybody was listening. And again, like this sense of like speaking into the void is enough to probably decide to just shut it all down because nobody's listening anyway. So what the hell's the point? But actually continuing to push is the secret that unlocked for me. And what I learned through that is like, there is this tipping point where eventually things will start to happen. People will start to discover it. Not only will they start to tune in for the new episodes, but they'll start to consume the back catalog of existing episodes. So now when I log into my Podbean dashboard and I look at like the downloads, like, it starts to look a bit more interesting now than it did a year ago, let's say. But look, like the secret to starting is just starting. There is no impediments other than yourself and your own ambition and willingness to put yourself in that position of discomfort. That really is it. And it's not that compelling of an answer, but like that is just the cold truth of it all.
Absolutely, Jesse. And to add to that as well, I mean, I've noticed from your podcast that the fact that you are as consistent that you are as well is a huge upside to this as well, and a really important thing to carry with you as well. As you point out here, it can be difficult to start a podcast because it's a big commitment, right? To start an episode of a podcast. It's like 30 minutes, your episode usually are, and it's quite a lot to ask from someone to spend 30 minutes to listen to a podcast of yours. And so that kind of getting over that first hump into getting people to trust you and to trust your podcast when there's like a million other podcasts or a million other pieces of content that they can consume, but they choose to consume your podcast. It takes time, and like it takes time to get people to give it a go and to give it a shot and give it a try, and then hopefully you can start retaining that audience after a while as well. And I like what you say here as well, that it's a lot about just getting started and then staying consistent and then not giving up. But also to add to that as well, I think seeing that, like, if we think about like how do people kind of choose what content they want to consume, they usually don't end up listening to a podcast or watching any form of content for that matter randomly. And so to get someone to pick your podcast, it has to have some form of value proposition, right? And if we look at the bigger podcasts today, like say the Joe Rogan podcast or Lex Fridman or Tim Ferriss, as you mentioned here, they are quite they are like generalists, so they will have like a wide range of guests on the podcast, and there isn't really a clear red thread other than people like the host. I think those are the kind of exceptions, but generally podcasts, I think especially when you start, you should find some sort of niche that you want to attack, right? Like if you want to learn about the iGaming industry startup landscape in North America, there is one podcast that is excellent and where you can do that, right? So I think you did the absolute right move on that front as well, of just kind of creating an identity around the podcast. And I think that's also something to think about if someone is considering to start a podcast, is like, what niche can they create? And then stay consistent with that niche and then build the audience over time. I think that's also kind of part of the success.
I completely agree, Pierre. And like, I'll add to that by saying that the word niche is quite an interesting one, right? Like, you're correct that my podcast is very niche. So the way I talk about it, there's actually 3 niches to mine if you think about it, right? So the first niche in the broadest sense is it's a business podcast, right? So it's in the business niche. Right. Underneath business, then we're segmenting it to a specific industry, which is betting and iGaming. So it's a niche within a niche. Then further, one level down is I'm only focusing on the early stage ecosystem within this industry, within the wider business niche, right? So It's very niche. It's very narrow. As I'm always very quick to proclaim to people, like, it's not doing Joe Rogan or Tim Ferriss numbers. It never will. And that's okay. My audience is one that is hyper relevant, hyper targeted. It's very relevant, compelling content for that audience. And it doesn't need to be more than that. And I'm okay with that. And I think to your question around, like, for other people that are maybe considering starting a podcast, my advice would be, like, number one, everybody probably should at least try starting one. Everybody has some amount of insight or expertise or perspective that's worth sharing. And nothing is too niche to share. There's always going to be an audience for everything. And, people shouldn't be constrained or inhibited by the sense that, like, whatever it is their podcast focuses on, that it's too uninteresting or niche or narrow or whatever. That's not true. That's a story. Everybody has a story to tell. Everybody has interesting insights to share. And I really do think everybody should at least try, right? Least of which good things could come out of it if you stick with it. Like, from a personal branding perspective, right? Obviously, there's a whole bunch of benefits that come from that. Credibility, you can start to establish yourself as a credible authority on a certain topic. And then obviously, you do it long enough, interesting things start coming towards you. So you end up becoming a bit of a magnet for stuff coming your way. And at least in my case, like, there's a lot of interesting stuff that hits my inbox now that I can really only attribute to the podcast and sort of it being that magnet out there that brings these things into me. So just to put a stamp on it, I think everybody should at least kick the can on it once, try it, and just see. Really, there's no excuse here in 2023 to not do it. Like everything, I think like 80-something% of podcasts will eventually like stop producing new content within the first 6 months. So even by sort of staying consistent for 6 months, you're already placing yourself in the top like 10 or 15% of podcasts that are out there. So no excuses, everyone, is the takeaway here.
Absolutely, Jesse. I love that we are like 30 minutes into this podcast. We just covered the second point of the agenda of too many points here. Not to crack a joke, but 2 podcast hosts walks into a bar. No one walked out for 3 days.
Nice.
Anyway, let's move on to the next one.
Sure.
Really interesting. So again, you are probably the person with the finger on the pulse as it comes to the startup landscape of the industry. Not the funds, not other industry players. I think you are the person who knows the landscape best. Not to put too much pressure on you here, okay? But still, I would love to talk a little bit more about the startup landscape in general of the industry. If you were to summarize kind of the state of play of the startup landscape of the iGaming and online sports betting industry today, what in your opinion is the state of play right now?
Well, it's a big question. Coming at it from a few different angles here. I think it's hard to answer that without, I guess, acknowledging just sort of the macroeconomic backdrop and obviously, sort of the trickle down effect that has on the early stage part of the ecosystem. And, we talk about sort of funding and, I recently shared some data in the Betting Startups newsletter. Quick plug for my newsletter.
Right.
I recently shared some data in there from Crunchbase, which put out an article a couple of weeks ago, which showed in Q1 of this year, global venture funding is down. I think it was 53% year over year compared to Q1 last year. So, taking that into context, the funding landscape is definitely an issue right now. That being said, VC funds and firms raised record amounts of new capital in 2022. So there's actually the slowdown in funding isn't for a lack of capital available to be deployed. On the contrary, there's record amounts of dry powder sitting there right now. I think I saw some data the other day. There's like $580 billion globally in venture firms' accounts that are basically waiting to be deployed. So there's a lot of funding out there right now available, but there is a slowdown. So how do you sort of reconcile that disconnect? The reality is you can no longer raise money with a pitch deck and a dream, I think is what it boils down to, right? A year ago,
right.
2 years ago, even, less than a year ago, that was still somewhat true. If it was true then, it's definitely not true now, right? Investors are looking for sound fundamentals. They're looking for the things that they probably should have been looking for all along anyways. And the hype and sort of the exuberance of all of that is been deflated a little bit. But that's not a bad thing. That's a healthy correction. All that being said, the early stage ecosystem within the industry is as healthy as it's ever been. There's some strong companies that we can point to as examples of that. Despite the fact that Q1 funding was a little bit slower, we're only a few weeks into Q2 here. We've already seen a number of funding announcements from early stage companies in the space, right? Profit Exchange just announced a $10 million raise. Beyond Play just had a $5 million something raise. There's a couple other ones I'm forgetting in the last couple of weeks, but it's really hard to talk about the startup landscape without, I think, addressing that first and foremost on just sort of the funding and capital side of it all. I think looking at it from another perspective as it is right now, as I see it, they're, especially for the B2B startups out there that are targeting the operators as their potential customers. We're seeing a lot of movement right now in the US specifically with some of the operators there. And, what does that mean for startups that are pitching their wares to the operators? We've seen some operators, shutter operations already. We're all reading the headlines like this week about, rumors of PointsBet and, what will become of it in the US market. And all of these sort of challenger brands, it's, can they sustain operations, right? And that makes it very difficult for B2B startups, I think, to properly really sort of project their business and forecast their future business, not really knowing sort of that their customers will ultimately be there for years to come. The concentration of market share amongst sort of the big four, which is what, 85% right now or whatever the number is, give or take 5%. It makes it difficult, but there's still a ton of opportunity there. But I think for those on the B2B side, really, getting that traction is even more important than ever, just because it is such a dynamic landscape right now amongst the operators and with their own operations really trying to sustain that. And a lot of them, obviously waiting for iCasino to emerge a little bit more persistently across states, and that being seen as sort of the path to profitability. And then for the startups in the meantime, it's incredibly difficult to sell. All that being said, for those that are successful in getting their products integrated into some of the operators, there's a ton of success stories out there right now. The operators are still looking for innovation. They're still looking for ways to differentiate what is a very commoditized product right now in the US. And they're really looking to these early stage companies to be the drivers of that. So still a ton of opportunity. It's not all doom and gloom out there right now. And for good, strong teams with compelling products and a unique differentiator that adds value, there's always going to be opportunity for those types of startups.
Right. Steffi, and if you were to pinpoint some of the most interesting startups that you know today, say 3-4 startups, who would you pinpoint and why?
Good question. So yeah, look, even before the podcast, right? When I was with Pinnacle, part of my remit with Pinnacle was looking at new products in the market that Pinnacle could potentially leverage, right? So I was already out there talking to every startup anyway, which is also part of the reason I started the podcast. It was something I was already doing, so it just made sense. So I've seen it, to your point, like I've seen most things, right? I mean, I probably see as much as most investors get across their desk in terms of just different companies doing different things, and have a pretty good sense of the landscape. So there's a lot out there. As far as the podcast, 70-ish episodes, I've talked to lots of entrepreneurs. It's really difficult to answer that, but I'm not going to skirt the question. Maybe I'll slightly reframe it, Pierre, and I'll say, if I had to draft a 3-company fantasy startup team, who would it be?
Yeah. Okay. That's a good question.
I'll exclude operators from the list, though. So names like Profit Exchange, Sport Trade, Mojo, Underdog won't count. Ignoring those, 3 that I would put on my fantasy team. The first would be a company called Sharp Sports. Have you heard of them, by the way?
Not sure, actually.
Okay.
Tell me.
Sharp Sports, they're very cool. They're building an infrastructure layer between operators and third-party developers. And basically what they do is they allow, app developers to integrate users' sportsbook accounts into their apps and their products, which you can imagine would unlock a lot of interesting use cases for things like bet tracking, unified dashboards, personalization, things like that. So, they're very much taking the Ryan Murphy, who's the founder there, the co-founder, and Sam. Ryan sort of talks about Sharp Sports trying to be like what Stripe is to the internet in terms of being this infrastructure layer that sits between everything, behind every sort of e-commerce transaction on the internet. Sort of their vision for Sharp Sports is to be that infrastructure layer that sits underneath a lot of the main sort of betting tools and products that are out there on the B2C side. So they're doing some really interesting stuff. If I was to make my own sort of index fund of startups on my fantasy team, they would definitely be in there, just because I think they're and they're also flying under the radar a bit, right? They're not they're B2B. It's really quote unquote boring stuff, which is really just connecting up pipes underneath the hood, which isn't that sexy or compelling, but it's a very interesting business. And they're definitely, I think, onto something pretty big there. So that's number 1. Second one I'll pick from my list is a company called Alt Sports Data. Other than being a very cool team of people and individuals, great team there. Alt Sports, basically what they're doing is securing official data rights from alternative sports leagues. Alternative sports being if you ever watched the X Games back in the day, basically a lot of the sports in there are what they would call alternative sports, right? Skateboarding, BMX, motocross, surfing, all of these sorts of things.
Anything you would see on the ESPN Ocho.
Exactly, right? Exactly. Yeah. So Alt Sports Data, they're getting the official data rights to a lot of these alternative sports. But then what they're doing with that data is they're developing betting markets and offering managed trading services to operators. And I mean, look, I was in my teenage years in the late 90s, and I skateboarded as a troubled youth back in the day. This, I don't know if it just really appeals to 17-year-old Jesse or what, but the alternative sports, I think, population is massive, right? People that skateboard, surf, snowboard, BMX, whatever. It's the sport that a lot of us do, but from a professional perspective, it really gets dwarfed, at least in North America, by the big 4 professional leagues, right? So I love what Alt Sports Data is doing in terms of tapping into that opportunity and sort of the passion of alternative sports fans. They actually I think just the other day, I just saw a headline that they just for the first time offered markets on a skateboarding competition with DraftKings. So DraftKings took Alt Sports Data, and then for the first time, skateboarding markets are being offered, which again, for 17-year-old me, is the coolest thing I could ever imagine. So Alt Sports Data is number 2 on my roster. Third and final one I'll wrap off right now, Pierre, is, and maybe this is a bit of the recency effect with my own podcast, but I'd be remiss to not include Beyond Play in that list, which is obviously a very familiar name to you and the iGaming Next podcast. Carolina Peltz might be the most impressive founder I've spoken to so far. I'm not just saying this disingenuously. She is just end to end, the most impressive founder so far. And what they're doing at Beyond Play in terms of bringing true innovation to iCasino is they have a very ambitious vision, a bold vision with a lot of technical uncertainty. But if they can get it right, they're going to be a massive company. And I think I mentioned a few minutes ago, they just raised $5-something million a couple of weeks ago. It was announced, which is obviously, a huge validation of what they're doing. And obviously for investors to agree with that by putting up the money, I think really proves that they are onto something. And their approach of turning solitary slot gaming experiences into a multiplayer experience really is true innovation. So those would be the 3 I would put in there. Apologies to the other 60 something that I missed. I'd love to put them all in there, but yeah, probably the big 3 would be those ones off the top of my head.
Solid top 3 fantasy startup list, Jesse. I must agree to that. And a great plug of Carolina Pelk. She is an absolute inspiration to not only the women in the industry who are looking to make a career and to kind of fight for their space, but for the entire industry as well. Carolina is just an incredibly gritty person who just gets stuff done, right? And on top of this high octane kind of startup gritty mode that she is in, she's also a mother of a young boy as well. So she is just proving that if you put your mind to something, you can achieve anything. She is absolutely amazing. I can't agree more with you on that front, Jesse. And I love the podcast that you did with her recently as well. That's also a great episode. Carolina talks a lot about her battling, kind of her insecurities in going through this journey, and the fear of am I able to kind of do what I'm supposed to do? She raised all this capital, and now she has to deliver, right? Like, it's a quite scary process to go through. That maybe not everyone realizes that even someone as confident as Carolina Pelk, the confidence that she gives away, oftentimes there's also a lot of kind of inner demons that you need to deal with along this way as well. And I really like how Carolina is kind of candid of talking about her own battles, so that other people can see that they are not alone in these insecurities.
Yeah, very well said, Pierre. And I can only endorse everything you just said about Carolina specifically. And like, what I really, really appreciated about her and the way she showed up on my podcast is, to your point, like, she was extremely vulnerable, right? And wasn't masquerading, or wasn't wearing the mask and saying, we raise this money, we're doing all this stuff, we're the best, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. She was very vulnerable about all of the challenges and the grind. And like, for her, this is the culmination of like a 20+ year career in this industry. So like, everything she's been doing has been like laying bricks to slowly build this thing, and it's all led her to this point. And there's a lot of personal challenges that come with that, and her ability to open up and share those and share that with the audience, and I'm sure a lot of other people resonated with that, but it really doesn't get talked about as much as it should, in my opinion. So yeah, shout out and credit to Carolina and the team at Beyond Play. They are crushing it, and no doubt will continue to crush it.
Absolutely, and Carolina, she talks a lot about the imposter syndrome. Then, right, is to kind of wrap it up in one term, and something I found interesting in that conversation, and it's something I would like to talk to Carolina about a little bit more, is that she talked about like, how do you overcome imposter syndrome, and you kind of have to accept that it's there, and try to fight away the thoughts and so on and so forth. But I would actually take it a step further with imposter syndrome and say that imposter syndrome is there for a reason, and it actually can be a good thing to walk around with imposter syndrome. Because if I would choose a person to have on my team, I would much rather choose the person who is second guessing themselves, and it's like asking themselves, am I really doing the right thing here? Rather than the person who just kind of comes in and with like 100% confidence and assumes that everything they do is perfect or whatever. I think imposter syndrome is like a champion by your side, as long as it doesn't take over, as long as you don't let it escalate. But it's the same thing for a lot of things in life. I mean, there's a lot of like words or kind of syndromes that have a negative connotation, that oftentimes in the right dose is a positive thing for you. I think it's a good spin to put on this. And I think certainly Carolina is a great example of that, where the imposter syndrome manifests in her, of her just working incredibly hard and really doing the right thing. Right, that's how it looks like on the outside when you look at Carolina. Yeah. Yes. On to the next point, Jesse. Here, I want to talk as well about a point that you mentioned earlier, which is the fact that there are just a few incumbents in the online sports betting and iGaming industry in the North American market. There's 4 operators, as you mentioned, that own something like 85% of the market share. 2 of them, FanDuel and DraftKings, they own, like 70% to 75%. So it's kind of like going from a duopoly, from an oligopoly to a duopoly in the industry. It seems like the bigger only gets bigger. What do you think this means for the startup landscape? Because oftentimes you have these, you have a quite vibrant startup landscape in the North American markets, but really and truly, many of them are only fighting for a couple, like 1, 2, 3, 4 operators or potential customers. Not everyone can win, of course, and that means that these operators have a quite big, power in and a big say in how the startup landscape will evolve. So what do you think? Is this a problem? Do you think? Am I taking this a little bit too much to the extreme? How does this affect the startup landscape?
I mean, my personal view on it is probably it doesn't, at least as of today, it doesn't affect things in a material way. I mean, over a long enough time horizon, yes, it does. If you think about a world in which there's true consolidation and there's only, true oligopoly where there was only, 2, 3, or 4 operators serving all of the US market. Obviously, that's not the case. What we have is dozens of operators basically fighting for that last 10 or 15% of market share. So what does that mean for startups in the industry, and particularly those that are, again, selling B2B, that see these operators as their target customers? It's probably a natural instinct to say that is a problem. I think the reality is, though, that these dozens, the 20-ish or 2 dozen-ish operators are really fighting for the remaining market share. I think that actually creates opportunity for a lot of the startups, right? These guys, again, are really looking for ways to differentiate, to capture mind share, capture the attention of people out there that are facing, what is a fairly commoditized landscape from a product perspective. There really is just opportunity out there still, albeit that, and the way I like to think about it, Pierre, actually, this is a good analogy that might sort of actually frame it better. If you think about going hunting, right? Sport hunting, you can go rabbit hunting, you can go deer hunting, or you can go elephant hunting, right? 3 different animals of 3 very different sizes, right? In the context of startups, I've always liked to think about it this way in my time, is that, if you're out hunting rabbits, rabbits are very small, so you have to kill a lot of rabbits in order to feed yourself, right? So you're continually out there finding the next rabbit to kill, eating what you kill, so on and so forth. Next level up is a deer. Deer is bigger than a rabbit, right? So you have to kill less deer in order to feed yourself. You still have to kill several, but with each deer you kill, you can eat for a little bit long before needing to find the next one. Then the next rung up is the elephant, right? You only need to kill 1 or 2 elephants to really eat forever. Not entirely true, of course, but point remains. I think if we sort of apply that metaphor to the landscape in the US with operators, right? The startups out there, I think, have a lot of options to go deer hunting. I think there's a lot of operators out there that are sort of shaped like a deer in that metaphor, where they're a good size. You get a couple of them, and you can have a very nice business and likely sustain your business for the long term. Elephant hunting is much more difficult, I think. And obviously, to your point around consolidation of the market share to just a few of the incumbents, these are the elephants. It's very difficult, I think, for startups to sell into those. But for those that can, sort of cross the Rubicon and actually get in there and actually integrate a product or a service or whatever with one of these elephants, these startups are going to be very well positioned. So, look, I don't think, any industry with monopolistic forces, obviously, is something to be concerned about. I don't think we're there yet. I think there's still lots to go around. I think some of these sort of I don't want to call them tier 2 operators. I don't want to disrespect anybody, but sort of the tier 2 operators in the US market right now, I think are still very viable targets for a lot of the startups with B2B offerings. And I think that's going to continue to be the case for years to come. Again, over a long enough time horizon, will that continue to be the case? I don't know, but certainly for now, I wouldn't be too concerned, despite the sort of alarming headline that this concentration is happening from a market share perspective.
Right, and just as a disclaimer here to the listeners, no animals were harmed during the recording of this podcast. I like the analogy. Jesse, another point as well, going back to the startup landscape and zooming in on the founders themselves, since we have talked to so many founders at this stage, is there a red thread between the founders that you interview? Because kind of going on this startup journey is a very particular journey to go on, and it's obviously filled with hazards, filled with walking through a minefield of dangerous things, and your success rate is going to be super low. And so you would imagine that there's a very particular type of person who does something as stupid as founding a startup, right? But is there any personality traits that you have noted? Is there any red thread in the founders that you have spoken to?
Yeah, I'll answer that in just a sec. But just to your last point there, I think, how does the saying go? Something like, entrepreneurs are the only people willing to work 80 hours a week in order to avoid working 40 hours a week, right? Like, people like me who are like, I can't work a full-time job, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. So I spend twice as much time trying to do my own thing to avoid actually getting a job.
That's a good summary.
No, but to your point, yeah, of course. I think there's absolutely some, I guess, patterns, each conversation's a data point, pattern matching across those data points. And I think there's a few characteristics in the people that I think need to exist in order for them to be successful ultimately. Probably the first thing I've come to learn over, my own career and my own journey is like over indexing on EQ or emotional intelligence might be the single greatest thing a person can do, not only for themselves, but again, through the lens of entrepreneurship and starting a company. People with high EQ, I think, are extremely well positioned to succeed. People without high EQ are going to struggle a little bit, right? And just breaking that down a little bit here, right? Like, what is EQ? Emotional intelligence. I mean, people with high emotional intelligence can, number one, like recognize their own emotions and emotions of others, and sort of use that emotional information to like guide their thinking and their behavior, to distinguish between like different feelings and to like label them appropriately. And maybe most importantly, like they have a high ability to adjust their emotions to adapt to changing environments, right? So it takes a lot of self-work to get clear on one's emotional intelligence, and doing that work is difficult. It's also scary. Personally, I worked with a leadership coach for a couple of years to like really dig into that myself and like try and develop my own EQ. And, it's always a work in progress. There's always work to be done there. But, Caroline is a great example of, again, I don't want to turn this podcast into a Beyond Play plug, but like Caroline is a founder that has exceptionally high EQ from what I could take away. And again, pattern matching, I think that's one of the characteristics of founders that is sort of a prerequisite to success. A couple other ones, just quickly to name them, and then we can kind of pull on the thread here. But I also think the successful founders have a high degree of curiosity, right? So constantly asking questions, seeking to understand what's going on around them, challenging assumptions, challenging the status quo. Just that overarching sense of curiosity is another like really critical factor in my opinion. Somewhat extending from, I guess, EQ is then humility. I think humility is something that all, again, successful founders have to some extent. So, can you, especially once you start getting a bit of success, right? Can you check your ego at the door? Can you manage that? Can you be willing to admit you don't know everything? Can you show that you're coachable, right? Like, are you willing to be coached and to learn and to be wrong? Having humility is crucially important. And then I guess the final thing I would add to my list here is empathy. This one might be a bit controversial because I know not everybody agrees with that, but I say empathy through the lens particularly of companies that are at the earlier stage, probably even like pre-product market fit. I think empathy is brutally important because the reality is when you're pre-product market fit, you're still working to find the solutions to your users' problems. And in order to like really truly understand what the problem is you're seeking to solve in the first place, you need to have a high degree of empathy for the people that are experiencing that problem. So yeah, I think taken together, like empathy, humility, curiosity, and just high EQ seem to be like the common thread that I've seen so far through all of these conversations I've had.
Yeah, it's a great breakdown, Jesse. Just to share like an interesting kind of fact I heard and I was reading about in a previous podcast. There is 3 diagnoses that overperform professionally, that do really well as entrepreneurs and as professionals. So first of all, people with Asperger syndrome, people who are on the spectrum, they tend to overperform in their careers. And the theory behind that is that because people with Asperger, they kind of lack the ability to understand social cues, they form their own opinion so strong that even though people tell them that they are wrong, they are not able to hear that they are wrong, essentially. And so they kind of stick to their guns. So if you imagine people like Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Peter Thiel, like those kind of like Silicon Valley legends, they have gone so much against the stream, and they have been so like unorthodox, and especially Elon Musk obviously has like totally transformed industries beyond any comprehension. And that comes just from kind of sticking and holding on to your belief and not letting people kind of intrude with their own kind of opinions. I thought that was interesting. A second one that overperforms professionally is people with ADHD. So because of the like incredible energy that comes from that diagnosis, people can kind of kind of push through with this like enormous energy and pulling in the long hours and so on when they get obsessed with a project. And then thirdly, it's quite interesting, and I don't really have an explanation for this, but third is people who are anorectic actually tend to overperform in professional life as well. I can't tell you exactly why that is, but those are the kind of three diagnoses that are overperforming a bit. And if I would look at myself, and we spoke about this just before the podcast here, but I picked something up in a previous call that you and me had, where you mentioned at some point, oh, it's my ADHD that is acting on me and whatnot, and so. I can see that in myself as well from time to time, that I have a little bit of those tendencies. And my girlfriend as well, she is not diagnosed with ADHD, but she would definitely be diagnosed with ADHD on a milder side of things. And how that manifests with her is that she has like an incredible energy. She has a million ideas that she gets super excited for, but she struggles to kind of stay consistent and to kind of focus on one thing. She wants to do like a million things at the same time. And so she kind of like in her like journey, she is like learning how to use this energy in a productive way rather than a destructive way. And so I want to kind of pass the ball over to you a little bit, Jesse, because I know that like you might have a little bit those tendencies as well. Like, is that something you think about? Like, do you see potentially that energy that you have on the like kind of like lighter side, on the ADHD side? Do you see that as something that you use as something positive? Is that something sometimes hinder you, or how do you kind of deal with that on a week-to-week, year-by-year basis?
Yeah, it's a really interesting perspective and conversation, frankly. So, I guess first thing I'll say is, and we talked about this before we started recording, but just for the benefit of the audience, I did sort of talk about my ADHD, but I will disclaim, like, I personally haven't gone in to see if I actually have it. So I'm sort of using that maybe incorrectly, but nevertheless, like the I guess another way to call it for me, and maybe from like an entrepreneurial perspective, is like shiny object syndrome, right? And I think this is something that to some degree we all have, whereby, we're all committed to this thing that we're on, but along the way, along the journey, there's always something that shows up or emerges along the side of the road. Distractions, yes. Right? And a lot of them are compelling. A lot of them are sexy. Like 6 months ago, we probably had a lot of startups that were focused on this thing. Now all of a sudden, like AI is this big topic, right? And that's a big shiny thing, big shiny object that's going to potentially distract a lot of people from their core mission, right? So, it's interesting. For me personally, like I definitely suffer from that. And I think if I was to sit down and like write out all the different things I do in my day, it would probably point towards something like that. Between the podcast, my accompanying newsletter, I have some other ambitions around that. Separately, I have another project. I've built, talk about this if we want, but I've built the industry's largest dedicated job board. So like that's a thing. I'm advising a couple startups in this space. I'm, always talking about different consulting. So like I'm my ability to focus is like near zero, I guess is what it boils down to. And, your question around whether that's a good thing or a bad thing or somewhere in between. I mean, it's a bit of a hedge here as an answer, but I mean, somewhere in between, I think it is the reality, right? I mean, if you're constantly responding to every new cue that comes up or everything that shows up on the journey, you're going to get nowhere, right? We know this. You need to have some amount of like sustained focus. And, we talked a while ago about like podcasting and like the importance of consistency with it. It's no different with anything else. Staying consistent, staying focused is important for execution. That all being said, I do also believe like it's perfectly okay to continuously, and you should also continuously assess the landscape around you as you're doing your thing, as you're focused on your thing. You need to be continuously looking around, right? The world's always changing around us. We need to be aware of what's happening around us. That requires us to be, turning our heads and looking in different directions, even away from the thing that we're chasing. So long as we turn our head back to that thing that we're chasing at the end of it. So, look, like, for me personally, like I see it as for me, it's a good thing. I lean into it. I'm an ideas person. I discard 99% of the ideas, but the 1% that I think are actually interesting, like I want to see those through, and I'll find a way to make space for those. I need to do a better job of that because the other side of that is like you take on too many things and you end up drowning. You can't do anything. So there's a balance to be had there. But it's an interesting question, Pierre. I think, there's a lot of people I certainly speak with that have some version of the same story. So it's a common one. I guess to put that out there as well, like for people that, identify as having sort of these patterns as well. Like you're not alone. Like, most of us seem like we're like this to some extent. I don't know if it's, chalked up a little bit to like our collective attention spans being somewhat shortened by like social media and just like our consumption patterns. I don't know. Obviously that's probably part of it, but I do see that as being like a superpower. And the three examples you cited, like definitely are superpowers as well for those people, for those individuals. And the ability to take something that could be construed as a negative and spinning it into something that is actually a superpower, I think is powerful stuff. And those are certain examples. I think there's other things too that could be seen as detriments that are actually superpowers. And for entrepreneurs, we come in all different flavors, shapes, styles, whatever. There's a lot to be learned, I think, from people that do have some of these challenges that maybe not everybody does. So yeah, look, I could probably stand to focus a little bit more. I'm not going to lie. My wife certainly agrees with that. She's like, "What did you do today?" Last night I was making dinner and she's like, "What did you do today?" And I kind of rattled off like 5 or 6 things. She's like, "What?" Anyway, so like, so there's truth in that. But yeah, look, I'm trying to channel it as like a positive thing in my case. And yeah.
Exactly. No, I think that's a great point. And what we talked about before is like that type of energy in a certain dose is an incredible asset, right? And to illustrate that you are definitely not the worst in that field. I don't know if you've seen this meme, where Homer Simpson, the GIF, when he goes into the bush.
Oh yeah.
And then he emerges as something else. And there was this really funny version where there was like at first you are a Web3 expert, and then you withdraw into the bush, and then you come out as an AI expert, which is kind of like the next big thing. And you see people do this a lot where they have a hard time to stay consistent, and so they just move on to what is the latest hype, basically. And because they do that, they are never able to kind of establish themselves as an authority in anything, right? Because they're always moving on to the next thing. Because often what happens with say, right now we are on AI summer, but we've been in AI summers before, and after the AI summer comes the AI winter, and then those are the first people that drop off into the next hype that emerges, right? And so when the crypto hype, the reason crypto hype started, a lot of new people kind of emerged as self-proclaimed experts, and then the AI hype started, and they kind of immediately moved on to become an AI expert, but they are never able to kind of stick around for long enough for the next kind of hype cycle to begin. Because eventually, if crypto enters a new hype cycle and it's a new crypto summer, then you will see the people who was able to navigate the winter, who really was able to kind of sharpen the sword, and then they will emerge as the leaders, not the ones who kind of jump from ship to ship to ship without finding any focus.
Well, I think that comes back as well to like, one thing we haven't really talked about yet, but like the importance of having conviction as an entrepreneur and recognizing that like whatever it is you're on, there's going to be hype cycles around you constantly. And you need to have deep conviction about what you're working on, because there's going to be periods, and like crypto is a good example where right now, right, we are in the crypto winter, and there's been a massive flight away from crypto and Web3 and NFTs and into things like AI or whatever like the newest thing is. But there's also this like population of people with deep conviction in sort of the promise of blockchain, the promise of crypto, that are continuing to focus, continuing to build. And they're basically trying to prepare themselves to be well positioned for when the next crypto summer comes, recognizing that these are just cycles that happen around us, and their conviction around their mission is really what's guiding them through this winter, which is obviously like the worst time to be for any entrepreneur. So yeah, like conviction is brutally important. Actually, a guest on my podcast, a recent one, Jamie Messler from the Gaming Society, who's awesome, by the way. She said this one thing when we were talking that really like stuck with me and resonated, which is that it's important to have conviction over consensus, right? So, in her case, I think she was, talking to investors for a previous company, and everybody was saying this won't work, this won't work, this won't work, right? So rather than like listening to that feedback as consensus, she really believed in her own conviction that it will work. She ended up doing pretty well with a company called the Players Tribune, and her co-founder, a guy named Derek Jeter. So like that all went fairly well, but that is only like really chalked up to the conviction she had. And the same can be said for other people that are, building during hype cycles and are, in the quote unquote winter time. It can be tough to sort of stay there, but that conviction is really what will get you through, and again, be hopefully well positioned for when summer comes.
Absolutely. And summer is coming, that's for sure.
That's right.
Jesse, to start rounding things off today, I want to, again, turn the tables on you, because I know that the question you always ask your guests is, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? And I thought that I didn't want to be worse here today, but then to ask the question back to you. Jesse, where do you see yourself in 5 year times?
So look, like it's interesting, like without getting like overly personal, like the last few months of my life has been life changing in a fairly negative way. So it's really like reframed a lot of like my thinking about the things I want to be doing, the things I want to be spending my time on, where I want to be focusing my energy and like making my impact. And I guess like as I reflect on all that and, talking a bit about like my journey in this industry so far over the last 13, 14 years, I love this industry, right? And I think one thing that like, you and I connected over right away when we first spoke is just like each of us has this passion for the industry which is really like what's kept us here for the long term. And both of us in what we're doing respectively, like is all about increasing sort of the overall like TAM of the industry, right? We're trying to spread the good word about the good things happening in it, trying to attract attention on it, trying to draw people into it, and really trying to help it grow ultimately, right? And for me, that really like comes back to like, look, hand over my heart, if I'm being honest, like, had you asked me 20 years ago if I would have seen myself like having a career in like the online gambling industry, the answer is like, no, of course not. But yet I found myself here and I find myself wanting to stick with it largely because of the people, right? The people I've met over these years and like the relationships I've kept have been absolutely life-changing for me. And, I got married last year. A bunch of people at my wedding, flew into my corner of Canada from all parts of the world. And these are people that I would have never known had it not been for my time in this industry. So like, I'm really passionate about it. I want to give more than I'm taking right now. So I'm really just trying to like create stuff that I think will help grow the industry, that again will reach new people, that will draw people into it, that will continue to help it grow. So I guess taking all that together and like back to your question around like 5 years from now, I still see myself helping to drive the industry forward in some capacity. I'm 41 now. Like I don't have the energy I did 10 years ago when I had my first startup. I can only reasonably assume in 5 years I'll have less energy than I have today. So I guess, through that lens, like I want to stay involved. I've been starting to do some advising to a couple industry startups, which has been something new for me, which has been really fulfilling and rewarding. And what I selfishly like about that is somebody that's like put his time in, like in the trenches, like really grinding hard. I see myself now being able to hopefully like impart a bit of my experience, my wisdom, my insights, whatever, and help the next generation of entrepreneurs. That's something I really see myself doing maybe a bit more of over time. But I think 5 years from now, Pierre, like I'm finding this like sweet spot whereby I'll be in my mid 40s. I'm still doing work in this industry, maybe albeit on like a bit more of like a part-time basis, maybe like a little less publicly than I'm doing now with the podcast. But I'm still very much trying to drive it in my own way. Well, at the same time, trying to find a bit of balance in other areas of life. I mean, I live on the west coast of Canada here on an island, which is like a pretty remote place, but the most beautiful place for me. And part of the reason I'm here is like the lifestyle. It's pretty chill. We're pretty relaxed. Nature's all around us. The mountains come down to the ocean. Like I love that. It's my happy place. It's where I want to be. And spending time in nature, whether like, hiking in the mountains, on the ocean, fishing, like this is where I want to be. It's what brings me happiness. And I think in 5 years from now, if I can find a good equilibrium between like the things that make me happy outside of my professional ambitions and endeavors, while still sort of having like my hand in the pot a little bit, and really trying to continue to support the industry however I can. Like that's the next 5 years for me. It's a bit of a non-committal answer, but as I say, like I'm really trying to get clear on that right now, just because I've had some major life changes over the last few months, and it's really reframing, I think, my own view on like what is important, where business fits into like the wider part of my life, and kind of reconciling like my own ambition with the just being present and being here now and just being grateful for the current moment and not worrying too much about like what the future will bring. So long rambly answer there, Pierre, but like I should probably worked on that one considering I ask everybody that. But that's it. Like I guess like yeah, some semblance of work-life balance, but like still involved in the industry, maybe just a little less hands-on 5 years from now.
Right. And so what you're thinking about right now is a lot about purpose in general of life, I can imagine.
It is.
You mentioned that it's been reframed, yeah.
Yeah, not to get too existential about it all, but exactly that, like purpose, meaning, impact, to some extent, thinking about legacy a little bit, like all of these things, which are big things, and I don't have answers for these yet, but now they've been sort of thrust into the forefront of my mind and are things that I am now thinking about, and then trying to map that to all of the things in my ADD and like all these things I'm working on, trying to map all of that. And that will be the sort of challenge for me in the coming months here, is to kind of integrate all of that together into a bit more of a cohesive answer to that question, and then start working towards that for 5 years from now.
Absolutely, Jesse. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast here, Jesse. And as I started the podcast as well, it's been great to get to know you in general. You are a fantastic person. And when I was introduced to you by our mutual friend, Benji Cherniak, he introduced us by saying how you are one of his favorite people that he ever met, more or less. And I can definitely see what comes behind that. So again, Jesse, thank you so much for taking your time today. It's been an absolutely brilliant conversation today, and I'm looking forward to follow up in the future with you as well.
Yeah, Pierre, look, thanks for having me, and I can only reciprocate everything you just said. Credit to you and your team for all of the good things that you are doing for the industry, insofar as the content, the thought leadership, the events, you guys are doing some really special stuff. So I, acknowledge you for that. And on a personal level, as you say, like, I think there's a lot more for us to talk about as we go forward here together. So, let's see what the future brings. But for now, Pierre, thank you so much for having me. If people are still listening to this an hour plus later, thanks for bearing with us here. But it's been a great conversation, Pierre, and hopefully we can do this again soon.
Thank you so much.